G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle, and today let's take a look at the troubled history that is the Heresy and 40k community relationship with one another. This is a spicy opinion, so try and enjoy the episode. Now before I start, please note that I will say statements like 40k players or 30k players as a generalisation. Obviously, not all people will fit into such simple categories, but rather than stop the flow of the video every 10 seconds to clarify some point, I'm going to assume that the internet is made up of civilised adults who can extrapolate my intent. Fat fucking chance. Alright. In 2012, when the Horus Heresy first appeared, those of us who went for it, as a general rule, were drawn to the system due to our experiences with Imperial armour, and we really liked the more realistic take on the fictional universe, with battered and beaten Marines, with paint flaking off power armour, this kind of look and feel. The Heresy appeared to be almost like a historical system. And this is not a point to be glossed over. The very fact that it's perceived more like a game of bolt action than 40k, I think is key to the identity crisis that plays us even today. 30k players obsess over things like power armor types, when and where events take place, etc. This is because we're invested in the narrative. The narrative and the story the models tell is equal to or more important than the game. Now contrast that with 40k, where the game is very much front and centre and the people participating seemingly lack any objective standards. The system has become so lax with 40k that list design, theme, hobby skill, that doesn't really matter. You just focus on doing whatever you want. It's become a total Wild West, and I know that may be hard for some to hear, as if I'm taking pot shots at the system, and yeah, okay, I kind of am, but unfortunately, the people who are most prominent in that community for the wider world to see are the people competing in big events with their min-maxed armies, often of mediocre hobby levels. Now, don't confuse this with attacking people for a lack of skill. That's not my intent. So let me be crystal clear. Painting bad is fine. Building models poorly is fine. But the lack of community drive to push people to do better, to reach for the stars, is what the problem is. If you have a shit army, people will call it totally acceptable and will actively compliment you on what doesn't deserve compliments. Compliments should be earned, and participation trophy level compliments are hurting the person more than encouraging them. And I do mean that word too, encouraging, because we should encourage people, but we don't do it at the expense of their hobby. These are of course highly controversial thoughts I'm expressing, because the mere statement that we should hold the hobby to some kind of objective standard is anathema to many. Now that we've spoken about the 40k/30k hobby divide, which stems all the way back from 2012, we land on 2013 and the first influx of players. You see, 40k players tended to treat anything Forge World as a broken mess. Due to a couple of units having overpowered rules, they hissed at Forge World miniatures on the tabletop like a vampire exposed to garlic. And with the strategic carpet bombing of balance that was 2013's 40k codexes, that opinion kind of changed. You see, 2013 gave us Tau, Eldar and Marines in rapid succession, and essentially killed all semblance of balance in very, very early, just 6 months into the life cycle of that edition. This led to a massive exodus of players who were fed up with the system, especially those playing Chaos Space Marines. When you have the option of Legions or Vanilla Paste, most people chose Legions. For many friends of mine, they like the idea of the level playing field that all the Legions, which drew units from the same book, provided, and with the twin factors of Forge World often being cheaper, as well as somehow more balanced now, it was easy enough for them to jump across systems. All remained really well within the Heresy community, but it did struggle to find its own identity over the first 3 years or so. Eventually, an aesthetic really began to take shape. Events began to occur, which is in and of itself amazing, as none of the other Forge World books really held too many consistent events across multiple countries around the world. It's not to say that people didn't play things like Bad Ab War or Siege of Vrax, but the Horus Heresy was on another level entirely. This shifted dramatically though with the release of Betrayal at Kelth, the original plastic Heresy set, and it caused the second great migration into Horus Heresy, because at the time it came out, 40k players were stuck in the final months of 7th edition, and they were fleeing it like rats from a sinking ship. Unfortunately, many of the people who made the jump at that time were exactly the people heresy gamers had fled from in the first place. And the union of the two was... well, there's no other way to say this. Heresy players mostly hated the influx. Now, the problem is it's a guarded beast. It's preciously held onto by its very passionate community. That community has stood by it, even when it was an expensive Russian niche. And now that it was becoming mainstream, a wave of power gamers came across and the clash of mindsets was troubling. This is the original point where the heresy elitism and gatekeeping accusations really stemmed from, and it didn't exist prior to about 2016, 2017. So let's take a look at both sides here and try and explain the problem. For 40k players, it was very unwelcoming to come to the community. They would say, I want to play this army of my choice. And that's how they would start their conversation. And then the beer bottles would quickly get thrown at them, and their instant greeting was anything from, well, polite discourse, maybe, through to just abject hostility from the 30k community. But for 30k players, on the other hand, it was a constant wave of power gamers with no respect for the universe that wrangled. And they wanted to turn the game into the same game that they were fleeing from, which just makes no sense. Obviously, this was an unhealthy relationship, but thankfully, tensions eased when Games Workshop took an Amber Heard-style shit on the bed of 40k with 8th edition, successfully conning all the people that left 40k into jumping straight back into it. So, flash forward through the next 6 years, and you have Heresy on life support. Yes, it has releases, but the system was clearly being deliberately neglected. From 2 books a year to 1 book every second year, from monthly releases to months without releases, the system starved. But the whole time, the 30k community was there weathering it, like a rock in a storm. They held events, they ran painting masterclasses, they kept buying books, making their own artwork, making army after army. Then we hit today. The very same problems that struck with Celt and Prospero, they're rearing their ugly head again. 40k is, to me at least, a terrible game system. It's been broken by inept writers who are not allowed to think for themselves because they're manhandled by corporate entities and marketing teams into writing these bloated books with contrivances left and right. The keys to the system are being handed to this mob on a silver platter, and already there are troubling signs. A boatload of content creators are out there dusting off Wikipedia articles to talk about the heresy and acting like they gave 2 fucks yesterday. Spoilers, almost every one of these people who have a newfound passion for the heresy have no clue. And, rather than take the time to discuss it, maybe watch some other content, read some novels, actually learn about it, they instead just put up content which gets key things wrong. I'll give one example. I won't name names, because it's happened multiple times from multiple creators. There's no need to cite any one person, lots of people are involved in this. And that's the biggest misconception. They think the game revolves around Primarchs. I can count the number of times I've actually seen Primarchs played on one hand in 10 years of playing Heresy. It's just not the focus of the system. They're cool, they're there in the background, but people aren't playing them on the tabletop very often. And you'd know this if you took the time to interact with the existing goddamn community. End rant on that particular subject. So, obviously there's a problem here. Sure, there's the protective heresy types, but there's also this weird subgroup of heresy players who think that fresh players should be welcomed into the system, regardless of how well they fit. This is justified because they feel growth of the hobby is more important than the health of the hobby. I'm not quite sure I track with the logic here. Now, at this point, I think it's important to point out that we do not just gatekeep. We should not just arbitrarily deny people entry to our system, for a host of reasons, ranging from, well, it's not really our right in the first place, it's not really our system. You could also say, there's no reason to be assholes. But do understand, we are protective of the system. For many of us who grew up on Games Workshop games, this is our last Games Workshop system. We've held on to it for a decade, and there are people alive and old enough to play the game now whose parents were some of the first people playing Heresy, and they hadn't even conceived the kids who are playing the game now. That's how long they've been into it. The system means a lot to us. We didn't just spend the money buying the miniatures. Anyone can buy miniatures, that's not an achievement. It's what we did with said miniatures. We converted them, we printed parts, we sculpted parts, we bought parts, we spent hours intricately taping off panels on tanks to create the Games Workshop system with the most consistently high-level quality hobby. When people go to events here in Australia, they would always remark at the level of hobby going on. It's not to say that people in the other systems can't paint as well or better, but rather than on an individual level, Heresy players just built their armies and painted them better. They often took suboptimal lists just because they had a unit they really liked and they wanted to fit it in. They thought it was cool. And that's why Heresy is so much fun. Because you go to an event, you get to see great armies with cool units, often with background stories you can read. And then, because the games aren't about how strong a list is, the games themselves are fun. The attitude's a total 180 to the 40k system that we left behind. So the 30k players, I say this. Welcome 40k players, Sigmar players, whoever they may be, so long as they are the people you want in your community. The only criteria is that they respect it, and everything we've worked so hard not just to build, but to sustain. Now for 40k Sigmar Kill Team players, or whatever other systems you play, I say this, do not come in and try and change the system to suit you. Most of you have 2 eyes, 2 ears, so watch and listen. Don't tell the community how it is. Don't get upset if they shoot down your ideas. Ask them why, because they almost always have a damn good reason. Yes, there will be dickheads out there. Always happens. Players who insist you can't use a Mars pattern Rhino because they're uncommon in the Heresy and you have too many. Ignore them. They're idiots and they should be treated as such for that degree of micromanagement. When you have 40k Primaris in your army though, and it's a 40k Primaris chapter scheme, and you try and fuckhand your shitty idea into the Heresy, don't be surprised when the community slaps the shit out of you in response. Anyway, the TLDR of this episode is that Heresy players are overly protective, but there's a lot of reason behind it. You just got to see it from their point of view. You may not agree with it, it may feel like gatekeeping, hell, it might actually be gatekeeping, but you're stepping into their world, and if you can't respect them, why should they respect you? Anyway, that's all from me. It's a bit of an opinion piece for you on this lovely Monday. I hope you all got something out of it, and please leave your thoughts and comments below. Catch you all on the next video.